One. Good evening. Welcome to this week's edition of the Press Club with me, Kendall Burton, and my co-host, Mr. Earl Buske. As usual, we review the stories making the news every week. This week being no exception. There's a lot to talk about. This week saw the meeting of the House of Assembly and Senate to discuss the constitutional review. But before we get to that, let's look at some of the headlines making today's newspapers. The Star newspaper: Senator offers solution to rapes and killings, sex in public. That's referring to Dr. Kentrisha Pierre's contribution during that same debate I referred to. The Voice newspaper: force policy for lawmen. The Nationwide, the government newspaper, which is part of the Voice newspaper, and inclusion in there: no child will be left behind, referring to the children's park set up in Marcia last weekend. The Mirror newspaper: charges leveled at AMU chief, another offshore school charged with fraudulent activities. Oh, and let's not forget Mr. Buske's favorites, the inserts: the Tonight magazine, the Sports and Health from the Star newspaper, and the Yo magazine from the Voice newspaper. The Star newspaper tonight focusing on the Mercury Beach, Mercury on the rise, Sports and Health, no stress, EC Global Insurance Football Tournament, and of course the Yo newspaper, Miss Queen of Grocery, the Vivacious Five.
Yeah, small things do matter.
Yeah, let's start with the debate of the Constitutional Review Commission report. A 300-page document. I know the House of Assembly did not get to complete the presentations on it. The Prime Minister did ask for the rules of the House to be relaxed in order to allow the members to speak openly, freely, according to their consciences. He said he had his own views on the document, which he would reveal at the end of everything. Obviously, that hasn't happened. They're scheduled to meet again on the 25th of August. That's Tuesday next week. The Senate met on Thursday to review the same document. As usual, I thought it was a very interesting interaction.
Did they all speak?
I believe they did.
Yeah.
I did not get to see the entire debate. At some point, I had to stop to focus more directly on my work. It's also the subject of the Voice editorial today, and I believe the Mirror newspaper as well, those debates in the House of Assembly. The Voice editorial: it is the people speaking. And in the case of the newspaper, interesting dialogue on constitutional reform. I think both, well, at least for the Voice newspaper, the issue here is some of the comments made to the effect that some of the parliamentarians or debaters were of the view and chastised or held certain views of the commissioners and the review commission, as if the document that was presented was formulated and presented wholly and solely based on their opinions and views, and the Voice arguing that it is the views of the people. I know you have your own views on that, and maybe we can start there with your own reaction and views on what transpired in the House, to whatever extent you were able to.
Yeah, thank you, Kendall. The meeting, both meetings of the House were historic in many respects.
Yeah.
It's the very first time we've had a constitutional reform process here. It's also the very first time that the House met to discuss the Constitution and what future it's going to have. The British didn't even give us that courtesy when they were preparing the Constitution for an independent St. Lucia. It is also historic from the standpoint that it is the longest constitutional reform process ever undertaken in the Commonwealth Caribbean. It almost took 7 years. It is the most comprehensive report, as you pointed out, close to 350 pages, 190 recommendations from 270 submissions by St. Lucians at home and abroad, because members of the commission did travel. So, and of course, the most historic aspect of it was that it was presented on the first anniversary of the death of the chairperson, Madam Justice Susie Dovey. So all of that was historic. It was also historic from the standpoint that, as you pointed out, the House rules were relaxed, but also the Prime Minister indicated that insofar as the government side was concerned, he had indicated to his fellow MPs on the government side that the principle of collective responsibility is withdrawn, so that each would speak for himself or herself, and he invited them to be frank and to speak their minds, and some did. And I think in responding to these submissions, we have to bear in mind that the MPs, in particular, elected officials who have a lot to lose or gain from the recommendations, being asked to speak, would, as individuals, as persons, respond to those things that would affect them. So I think we need to look behind, not just hear what the person is speaking, but look at who's talking and try to connect what they're saying with what, you know, their reality is. So I can see, and I do not expect any politician who keeps winning an election to support term limits.
Right.
You know, I do not, when Mr. Richard Pedrick says that if to be a president, you have to be born St. Lucian, then in his book, to be a prime minister, which would be the most powerful position under the recommendations, that to hold the biggest post in St. Lucia, you'd have to be a born St. Lucian. When I heard Mr. Pedrick say that, immediately what came across is that, well, Alan Shastney could never be Prime Minister of St. Lucia if that recommendation is taken. The whole question of same-sex marriages, there were, and I think what we've been responding to is individual sections of the 190 that individual elected persons and senators, parliamentarians have selected. So we are responding in the press and in public to the responses of the parliamentarians, their selective responses. But I still think that while it has been a historic exercise for all of the reasons that we've pointed out, I think that we need to understand what is at stake and look at the process. These are proposals to amend the Constitution. Now, interestingly, the proposals, the 190 proposals, fundamentally propose changes in governance and in how elected persons operate, whether elected persons, in fact it's saying elected persons cannot be ministers. Now you and I know that the average MP goes into an election expecting to be a minister if he or she wins. That is going to be off the table. So MPs are reacting to being told that it is being suggested and recommended that if you win an election and you want to become a minister, you have to resign your seat to become a minister. Now, this is not reinventing the wheel. That's what exists in the United States. No member of the cabinet, you know, is elected. Every member of the cabinet is selected by the president from outside of the Congress. What I think is absolutely necessary here is to understand that we have an anomaly where, in this particular case, changes being recommended would significantly affect members of the House of Assembly and the Senate, who are now the ones being asked to decide whether these proposals go ahead or not. They're not being asked to change the Constitution, because what I haven't heard anybody say is the reality that whatever recommendations are made, and recommendations will be made, it will have to go before a referendum. And a referendum is the most difficult thing to win in the history of the Commonwealth and the Caribbean. No country that has sought to change its constitution by referendum has achieved it. Trinidad was able to change its own because it doesn't require a referendum. Now, in elections, the winner is a half plus one. A half plus one
Yeah.
and you win. Referendum, 66.6, two-thirds. And in some places, 75%. When you look at the results of elections, which is the gauge, the percentage of persons who vote, in our case, it hovers between 50 and 55%. Now, if in that situation you need 66 point something percent, then we have to find ways and means to get more people to come out and vote. And a referendum is like an election. You
Yeah,
leave your home to go and stand in a line to vote.
Because you raise a very interesting point about the turnout. Because even at the level of the presentations and the forums and discussions, the town hall meetings on the constitutional review, how many or how much of the population actively participated in that exercise? How many are actually following the debate now? How many have actually gone online or sourced hard copies of the documents and studied, or even had a cursory examination of it? You understand that they can effectively participate in a referendum if and when it comes up.
How many of those public discussions were done in Creole? I mean, an interesting point was raised by a caller to one of my shows, and that is that he has heard or seen nothing about ensuring that Creole is one of our two languages. In 1997, when the present Governor General made her first throne speech, the government declared that we are bilingual. But that was a parliamentary declaration. But our constitution does not say that. Secondly, let us look at constitutional reviews. Let's look at Venezuela, where the constitution was reviewed. People might quarrel about what came out of that review from the standpoint of the adoption of a socialist roadmap. But coming during that process, every Venezuelan had a little book, about 4 inches square, with the draft constitution that you could pick up and look at and read. Now everybody reads Spanish over there. But not even here have we been able, before the parliamentary debate, to see a mass circulation of the recommendations. The recommendations have been submitted to Parliament. Are those recommendations going to go back to the people in whose name they are being given? Alexis B. Montgomery, or yes, a name, yeah. Alexis B. Montgomery, that's a columnist in The Voice, and on page 4 he starts off by saying the shock value stemming from the recommendations communicated by the citizenry of St. Lucia. Now, is it really the citizenry of St. Lucia? Who is the citizenry of St. Lucia? The recommendations are the recommendations from those who participated in the process in the name of the citizenry. But then the
representation of.
Yeah, but then the citizenry, again here we see, just like with elections, the citizenry only become citizens, or the way I put it yesterday was that Majo and Mr. Blow only become king and queen on election day. And therefore everybody who submitted to the commission will not say they were submitting on their behalf or on behalf of their organization, but it's easy to say that it was on behalf of the citizenry. How does the citizenry get to know the 190 recommendations, and when will they be brought up to date on what this is all about ahead of a referendum? And will a referendum, which is a political exercise in terms of asking people to express an interest on any issue, if that referendum, can that referendum go ahead and be treated as a national issue without the partisan elements? Because in the case of St. Vincent, where you've had the most fundamental approach apart from us, but over a shorter period of time, everything was done, but Ralph Gonsalves was unable to get a 66% majority. So all of the recommendations went away. But unlike other countries, as the Prime Minister pointed out, where the recommendations were being put forward by a government, which is made up by a party, the recommendations then, if it is seen like here, if it is seen that this is Kenny Anthony and the Labour Party, or Chasney and the UWP's recommendations, and you go into a referendum with that sort of thought, then it defeats the entire purpose. And that is where I think the next stage has to be, alongside what is happening in the Parliament, there needs to be the embarking on another national, I hate to use the word education process, but a process to inform, engage.
Yeah. And that was raised by Senator Stephen King, but we can talk a little bit about that after the break. With you for a break, we'll be right back. This is the Press Club with me, Kendall Button and El Busky.